don't hear anything, but Do the Denver Broncos starters have anything to prove in their final preseason showing against the New Orleans Saints? Which depth players have the most to fight for in this game against New Orleans? And I don't know, where are we at when it comes to the final 53-man roster projections and the depth at each position and where they carry? All things to come on today's rundown, but I want to begin with the starting unit, who we learned about a week ago over the course of the joint practice week with the Arizona Cardinals, will play for a limited number of reps in the final preseason game, something that traditionally speaking is not commonplace around the NFL. Every team handles it differently and structures their preseason and offseason in a way that they think is most advantageous to them. But traditionally speaking, the third or final preseason game is reserved for the highest evaluation to get those final tweaks into a roster for a coaching staff to put together their 53 and game day 48-man rosters ahead of the regular season. Well, Sean Payton elected not to play his starters really at all against the Arizona Cardinals because of the rigorous joint practice week that they had against Arizona here in Denver, followed after the San Francisco 49ers joint practice week where they went to Santa Clara, joint practice, and then played the 49ers. So now he skips the joint practice week game against the Cardinals in week 2, and then they will play here in New Orleans. And they didn't look that great the last time they were out there, right? In Santa Clara, it kind of felt underwhelming, especially when you saw Mac Jones and the backup Niners march down the field on an 8-play touchdown drive against the number 1 defense for the Broncos, who responded in kind after that, and Nick Bonito had his game-wrecking series and what have you. But for Bo Nix and the offense, as has been kind of a continued theme throughout the majority of the training camp, it's been more flashes and glimpses than it has been stacked days and practices where it feels like they're really in rhythm and on time and in sync. And in part, I think that is because of all the new pieces that are molded around Bo Nix in this offense. Forever in Broncos country, it was, how do we find the engine to this car? Who's driving it? And it was the revolving door of Trevor Siemian and Paxton Lynch and Drew Lock and Joe Flacco and Case Keenum and Brandon Allen and Jeff Driscoll and Russell Wilson and Brett Rippon, frankly. But we have that now. We feel pretty confident, I think, in Broncos country that Bo Nix is the bona fide potential franchise quarterback for the Broncos, and maybe the third iteration of that in the history of their franchise with the likes of Peyton Manning and John Elway. But it hasn't looked so smooth and efficient like it did on the back half of last season, especially in the passing game. And that is why they go out and they get J.K. Dobbins, they get R.J. Harvey, they bring in Evan Ingram, they draft Pat Bryant, and then you've got the emergence of Troy Franklin as well, who in conjunction with Pat Bryant have done so much in this preseason that they opted to trade one of their top 3 leading receivers from last season in Devon Vele. So will it come together one final time here in the preseason before the regular season begins and the real tests begin to start? In the preseason, the games don't count, but they do matter. So how much does it matter that the starting offense goes out there against New Orleans in Sean's former home and looks good? Do they have to score a touchdown? Do they have to put together a scoring drive of some semblance? Feel free to chime in and weigh in as you please. I think this is where the conversation starts to split in a nuanced perspective, because need, where you talk about must or need, like a must-win game or a gotta-have-it drive, well, that implies that if you don't do it, there's severe negative consequences. I don't necessarily think that that's the case, but I'll say this. Just because it's not absolutely dire or critical that the Broncos first team offense in the 8 to 10 or whatever reps that they're going to get against New Orleans goes out there and scores a touchdown or puts together a solid scoring drive, just because the alternative to that is not life or death, doesn't mean that one, I think we don't really want to see it, or two, that it doesn't go a ways toward showing that this Broncos offense as a unit with two new running backs and potentially an entirely new running back room with a new core of wide receivers, a joker in Evan Ingram, and all those new pieces that have come together have gelled properly enough to where we feel confident that a season that starts against Cam Ward and the Tennessee Titans and then goes with the Indianapolis Colts, which gives you a little bit of an on-ramp, but not much, because the 3-game stretch after that, where in your first 5 games you play the Chargers, Bengals, and Super Bowl champion Eagles, things are going to get going here in Broncos country in a hurry, and a fast start is imperative for this team and this unit to be able to accomplish what Sean Payton, their head coach, what Bo Nix, their quarterback, and what I truly believe they as a team, evidenced by the culture that has permeated through that locker room and through that organization since Sean Payton got here, truly believe they can be, which is a legitimate playoff and potentially Super Bowl contender. So what do the starters think about the opportunity to play in this preseason game? Well, Quinn Miners was asked about how important he thinks it is and how much importance there is on preseason reps for guys even like him who are solidified in starting units. And Quinn said, a ton, a lot of it. I know that I'm physically ready. There's a big mental side of it too. Like, are you mentally ready to get ready for this season? Are you mentally strong enough to be ready for those moments of truth, of playing your best when it matters the most? That's really the point, I think, as a starter to play in these preseason games, is to really see how ready you are for this season. So the Broncos offense has maybe looked ready in the joint practice session with the Arizona Cardinals, where especially toward the end there, the first team offense kind of started to get their rhythm and their groove, which was a contrast to the way that it started and finished in 2 different places with the 49ers. But are they ready, as Quinn Miners has just listed? Well, there hasn't been a ton of evidence throughout the preseason and the joint practices that has shown in a training camp capacity that they're ready for a season where they're coming off of a 10-7 record with a wild card berth and has awoken eyeballs and expectations on this Broncos team that have largely looked elsewhere for the better part of the last decade. That is no longer the case. So is Sean Payton and is Bo Nix and are the Broncos as an offense ready to take on the NFL regular season and then the next step forward to build on last season, to where you maybe are looking at not just a wild card feel-good story, but a legitimate divisional round playoff threat, maybe even a true contender in the AFC alongside the likes of the Baltimore Ravens, the Buffalo Bills, the Kansas City Chiefs, etc. You're going to have to be ready to do that. And I think a good showing in the limited capacity that they will get against the New Orleans Saints in the final preseason game will go a long way toward showing that and building confidence in that internally and externally. Because as I mentioned, after this first 2-game stint of the season where they play the Titans and then they get the Colts, 2 teams that are pretty winnable and beatable by most metrics, the next 3 games after that began a legitimate gauntlet, and there aren't a ton of huge pockets of easy games throughout the rest of the regular season. The Broncos have a pretty nice schedule with difficult games mixed in that's going to force them to be on their toes more often than not. And I think that even though it doesn't truly mean life or death, if they don't look good against the New Orleans Saints, a good showing and preferably a touchdown drive would mean a lot. This game also means a lot to the significant number of depth players who are not in the position of Quinn Miners and are potentially fighting for their NFL futures by way of a roster spot on this Denver Broncos 53 in 2025. And we've talked about those names over the course of training camp and into this week itself, where we head into the final preseason game. And Sean Payton has talked ad nauseum about the quality depth that they have on this team, which I think is such a testament to George Payton and his front office staff, and Sean Payton and George Payton working together to find and evaluate talent that they think they can maximize, and then to go out there and do it. Well, really, since 2021, it feels like they have been significantly progressive in that regard. And it's going to force some tough decisions. We saw a tough decision via trade made this week with the departure of Devon Vele, who was your third leading receiver last season behind Cortland Sutton and Marvin Mims. And that was from a 7th-round pick, who you then flipped for a 4th and a 7th. And we don't need to go down the rabbit hole of good trade, good timing, bad timing, 5 wide receivers, 6 wide receivers, whatever. The point is, you don't go out of your way to ship a guy like Devon Vele out of town, even for the return that you got, if you feel like he is a meaningful contributor to this team and you have the luxury of being able to keep extra guys like that. Because the Broncos don't appear to have that luxury. They have multiple starters at new positions that have significant injury history, from Dre Greenlaw at inside linebacker, to Talanoa Hufanga at the safety position, to J.K. Dobbins at the running back position. And at each of those spots, there is at least consideration and concern to whether or not they need to carry more bodies in that room. And I think that is going to, over the next 72 to 96 hours, manifest itself in the running back room specifically, where I think the Broncos will keep 4 running backs on the roster, where I thought they would only keep 3 because of Devon Vele's presence in part. I think they will now keep 4, and it will be J.K. Dobbins, R.J. Harvey, Jaleel McLaughlin, and Tyler Bidet. And I think personally, Tyler Bidet is the 3rd running back in their evaluation. And I think Jaleel McLaughlin is maybe being saved from potentially being a practice squad level candidate if they were to only carry 3. But that doesn't even begin to broach the subject of the defensive line room, the cornerback room, the safety room, all of these other position groups that are going to have legitimate questions answered in this final preseason game as to how many they carry. Specifically on the safety room, another player in this case like Quinn Miners, who is in no danger of not making the roster, is Talanoa Hufanga. But he had a little bit of self-awareness and recognized the depth and talent within his own room that is a larger picture of the team as a whole. At the podium yesterday, Talanoa Hufanga said that he thinks this is the deepest safety room that he's ever been a part of. He thinks that they have very little drop-off at times between the starters when they come in and then the second and third string players. Excuse me, not Talanoa Hufanga, Brandon Jones. Brandon Jones at the podium yesterday, who also has no danger of making the roster, said, quote, "I've never been a part of a secondary this deep. Especially the biggest thing I've noticed is when the 1s are down, meaning the starters, the 2s go in, the 3s go in. Rarely is there ever any drop-off." I think that's super unique, super rare, especially in the league, and it's going to be tough for roster cuts that are coming up. I'm glad I'm not put in that position, because that would really, really be challenging for me to do so. Think about that for a second. A starting safety for the Broncos and in the NFL is like, boy, I am glad that I am not a backup right now in this room, because if I was, it would be really, really hard to make this roster. In a way, that's complimenting himself as a starter alongside Talanoa Hufanga. But it's a legitimate look in the mirror moment to say, hey, man, if I was Devon Key or JL Skinner, I would be stressed because I'm a talented player and there just may not be enough room for me in this year, in this capacity, and on this team. And I think that permeates throughout the roster, where you look at the DB room and a guy like Chris Abrams-Drain is your 5th cornerback behind a reigning defensive player of the year in Patrick Surtain, Riley Moss as the opposite boundary corner, Jaquan McMillan as your incumbent slot corner, and then first-round pick Jahdae Barron, who flexes inside and outside capability, and his head coach has said, we see him potentially transitioning and playing in both areas, putting multiple guys on notice in that regard as somebody who's waiting in the wings. From the interior defensive line perspective, the likes of Jordan Jackson and Inyoma Uwazurike, who are talented NFL caliber players that have to sit behind the likes of DJ Jones, Malcolm Roach, John Franklin Myers, and Zach Allen. That's a tricky position to be in. And so the opportunity for these depth players to make a lasting impression on these Broncos coaches in whatever limited capacity they are going to be able to get to do so, because there's only so much you can cram into a 60-minute football game, is going to have a significant impact on the roster construction, whether they keep 8 offensive linemen or is it 9? Do they go 6 defensive linemen or is it 7? We already know they're going to keep 5 wide receivers. But if you are a Devon Key, a Jordan Jackson, Ini Uwazurike, Karene Reed, and Jordan Turner in the inside linebacker room, Damari Mathis in the DB room that I just mentioned, where your top 5 guys are pretty well slotted and slated. How about Calvin Throckmorton and Will Sherman in the offensive line room? If you are one of these players mentioned here, whether it's Lucas Kroll or Karene Reed or Devon Key, whatever, this may be your last and final impression to try and make this team in 2025. And that is so much more a reflection of how deep and well cultivated and developed the Broncos have become on the back end, thanks to George Payton and his staff. And it's going to create the nightmare scenario, I think, that both Sean Payton and his front office have echoed, which is that players on this team that get cut after this preseason game in New Orleans are going to be able to make contributions and potentially 53-man rosters on other teams around the league. We certainly think that's going to be the case for Devon Vele as a New Orleans Saint, given the draft compensation that New Orleans just gave up to get him. But if you're looking at the names of guys like Lucas Kroll, who it appears is at best the tight end 4 behind a guy like Nate Atkins, who Sean Payton has spoke at length about the importance of and flexibility and versatility that he has, to the point where he is expected to make the 53-man roster without being on IR despite being hurt. And you have a Michael Burton, Adam Prentice situation at fullback. There's so many opportunities for these guys at various position battles around the roster to make this lasting impression, and I am going to be fascinated to see which ones emerge and who finds themselves just slightly on the outside looking in. Cannot wait to keep tabs on things. Tomorrow we get the early game in that window for Broncos and Saints at about 11 a.m. And very, very quickly after that, this Broncos roster will come into shape, and we will know how many cards and what cards exactly Sean Payton and company are dealing with for the 2025 season. And then begins the long journey that will feel like a very fast journey over 18 weeks to find out if the 10-7 season, the wild card berth, and the ending of the drought from playoff appearances to winning seasons was more closer to an aberration or a future sign of perennial excess to come. Stay locked into Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan. Keep tabs on all things Denver sports at denversports.com, from the Broncos to the Nuggets and Avalanche, Rockies, Buffs, whatever you want, we've got it. And the opportunities to interact with you live on our social media channels, on shows like Denver Sports Daily, The Rundown, and Orange and Blue Today is one of my favorite things that we have going for you. And it will get rolling again here on this show starting on Monday. I do what I love what I do. Second nature to put it